if there was a big bang down in your basement,
Yeah.
and you woke up and you looked over at your wife and you said, "What was that? What caused that?" And she went, "Nothing."
Yeah.
You'd be like, well, that's an excuse for wanting to go back to sleep. Right?
What's up, everybody? We're here with one of my favorite people.
What? Who?
Yeah.
I'm looking around.
Do you know
Oh,
that
me?
We met.
That's crazy.
I don't even think you know when we met. We met like 13, 14 years ago. We both spoke at some event in Orange County.
Okay.
And it was wild. And you were up there. And I don't mean to like call attention to this, but
Sure.
your face was making little things that it's doing right now.
Right, yes,
And you explained what was going on.
Yeah.
And it's not coffee. And for a guy who struggles to sit in any conference, especially when I'm actually also going to be one of the presenters,
Sure.
I was like, whoa, who is this guy? And I remember being like, dude, this guy is the real deal. Can you talk about your face?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. My
Is
faith
that rude?
and my face.
Sorry, we've been friends for 13
Yeah,
years.
no,
I feel
we're
like-
good. So basically what happened is when I was about 8 or 9, my parents got divorced. And the trauma of that event gave me Tourette syndrome. So if you go look up Tourette syndrome, like online.
No, I've seen What About Bob?
Yeah.
I know.
I mean, he's got some other things going on too. Baby steps. So... So lots of tics and like it's cerebral and it's body, it's muscle, so, but it's also like obsessive compulsive. So you like I would grow up when I was a kid, I would randomly like swear at people like, you like sit up, like, and just say these swear words at people and like hit certain things and like have to, do certain tweaks, So it's, the swearing for the most part is gone outside the golf course, but the actual just whatever, but the ticks and the face and it's still part of my life, and it's some days it's better than all of that. So it's Tourette's, and that's what it is. So if you get distracted by the facial tics, you can just listen.
It was so funny. I was at this thing the other day with you, and I was like, "Hey, I want you to meet my friend who has Tourette's." You're like, "No, because if I meet them,
if we go for lunch, I'll pick up 3 habits before the check comes." Yeah,
I think it's
contagious.
I think the reason why I appreciate it so much is because God has used you to pastor like some of the most significant. Like I used to introduce you as like the pastor of the largest church in Canada. I don't know if that's true, but
I don't know statistically.
But God used
probably
you
pretty close. Yeah,
from like basically a public speaker presenting the most important message on the planet, yet struggling in your mind the whole time you're talking with what you're thinking and what you're saying. And you're all, I've already said 25 F-bombs by the time I'm done with this. I was dying because that's so crazy how God will use anybody. And he can take things that,
100%.
disqualify us to everybody else. And
the stuff that we just think, I've made too many mistakes in life, God can never use me. God only uses perfect people.
Yeah.
I'm a bit of the poster boy for God can take you no matter who you are and use you not because of you but in spite of you. So yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
and so a couple of the books that you've written are basically for skeptics.
Yeah,
people who have intellectual barriers.
Yeah,
right. And so a couple questions that we have here I thought would be perfect.
Sure.
The first one is, how do I know if God is real? For sure.
Do you want to start reading or listening to the Bible, but you have no idea where to start?
I get the question all the time. I don't know the translation. I don't know where to even begin. That's why we made the 21 Days of Momentum Challenge. How many chapters are in the book of John?
21.
1 chapter a day, small podcast episode. You go through all 21 days. You take the challenge. What happens?
I think your life will be different. You will have hope for your day. You will have a security in hearing the voice of God.
So take the 21-day challenge today on the UNcomplicated app. Just look at the link in description or search your app store.
For sure.
For sure,
Right.
How do I know
for sure.
That he's real?
Yes.
Like a skeptic comes to you and he's like, listen, I have doubts.
Yeah.
But I just kind of want like to be at least 51%.
Yeah. So I grew up in a non-Christian family. So my father was a ardent atheist. So the first time I ever walked into church, I was 19. And the only reason I stayed was because there was pretty girls there. So it was like, hey, I love church. I thought church was going to be old shaggy carpets and smell like mothballs. And I walked in and it was like, boom. Everyone was 200 years old, but there was some hot girls there. I was like, I love church. This is great. This is fantastic. But that was the world I grew up in. Like I grew up in a world where my father wouldn't name my brother Matthew because he heard it was a name that they used in the Bible. And then my mom finally said, no, I want him to be named Matthew. Then 4 years later had me and they named me Mark. So clearly this guy never picked up a Bible before in his life.
It's hilarious.
Yeah, my middle name's Andrew. My brother's middle name is James. So we got 4 disciples.
Four
knocked out. Yeah,
disciples.
this guy didn't have a clue, right? He didn't have a clue. So did not like the church, did not like God. So I grew up as an atheist, and so. No Christmas, no Easter, no prayer, no Bible, nothing spiritual in our house. The pure secular, classic Canadian, post-Christian version of reality. It was my life growing up. And it's much of my family's life still. The only other Christian in my family was my grandfather. He died last year at 100 years old. And he just prayed for me. He was an amazing guy. So anyways, all that to say, I grew up in a world where I'm an evidential thinker. And some of you out there are evidential thinkers. And you think, I'm not going to believe something unless there's evidence for it to happen. I don't want to just believe something for the sake of it. So I had to start exploring. When I started exploring Christianity when I was 17, I was exploring it from a historical, scientific, philosophical, literature, all this stuff, psychological. I was like, is this actually, not just does it make me feel good, is it based on any evidence that I could defend when I go to sleep at night, or to anybody I'm talking to, where it's like, why do you believe in God? Because in my family's world, the dichotomy was, you're either smart and you don't believe in God, or you're dumb and you do believe in God. And that's laughable, because what the heck is the evidence for God's existence? Or isn't it? If God existed, why not? Why can't I see him? Why can't I touch him? Why can't I smell him? And right there, you have a philosophical problem, because you're not talking. That's like asking, what does the color red smell like? Interesting, right? You can't. The God isn't a physical. So you're already mixing up categories when you're asking the question. Well, let me bring my requirements for God's existence, and then if He doesn't meet them, then I won't believe, right? And so I remember I was on this podcast when the problem of Jesus came out, and these 2 skeptics wanted to interview me on miracles. And so they were ex-Christians, like missionary kids, and they're like hardcore scientists. They do a podcast on like what is the level of oxygen in the gas on Mars, or like this and talk about it for 2 hours. So I'm like, I go on this pod, I'm like, oh, these guys are just gonna light me up, right? I was like, whatever, I don't care. So I went on, and they're just going at me from all these angles.
And they're ex-Christians?
Yeah, oh yeah, like, and they're like, yeah, they know, right? Man. And so they're hitting me. So finally they said, listen, man, if God existed, why, if all these miracles are happening, why isn't there YouTube videos, okay, of all these guys in villages around Africa with their arms growing back and dudes like, we got all the technology, where's the evidence? Yeah. And I just said to them, guys, maybe God doesn't wake up in the morning with the top priority to convince you 2 that He exists. Maybe He's got other things going on in the world than to grow an arm back so you 2 on your podcast can believe He exists. And then they were like, I don't know what to say to that. Yeah. You know, it's like, because, so this is what I'm saying. We have these categories where, like, if you don't meet these requirements, I'm not going to believe in you. So that's going to go out the, you know, and so we have to ask legitimately the question, is there evidences to believe that God exists? So we're not quite at the question of like, hey, here's the right God we're talking about. That's later, because that comes to Jesus. Right. And like, is Jesus was He God, or is He God? Yeah. And if He was, you know, and that's actually one of the arguments. So if you look at the person and the work of Jesus, right, and you know that's historical. No historian's going to say Jesus Christ didn't exist. They're laughed off. Any university campus, you're laughed off if you try to think Jesus. We got more evidence for Jesus existing than Julius Caesar, than anybody. Yeah. And so Jesus existed. The question now is what He said about Himself true when He made all these claims? And one of the claims, of course, was He's God. And then it's like, okay, well, anybody can be crazy, fair, but did He raise from the dead? Which historians are looking at more and more evidence and going, there's a lot of evidence to believe that Jesus Christ actually rose from the dead. And they go through, you know, N.T. Wright wrote an 850-page tome on the resurrection, and it's all about Jesus. Man, from a historical vantage point, the chances are high that He rose from the dead. So if He rose from the dead, now we're working backwards to what did He claim? And He claimed to be God. So there's that kind of thing. But even before you get to Jesus, what are the things that I looked at and said, okay, I'm actually being convinced that God exists? So I'll break down. Let's do just two. Okay, 2 that stuck.
Give us 2.
Okay, 2. So the first one was, I started looking into I was in the science realm and just going, okay, scientifically we got to start there. Is there existing? So what I began to realize as I studied was all through history, philosophers and scientists believed that in the principle basically called contingency, which is the principle was this: if something begins to exist, it has to have a cause.
Gotcha.
Okay, so you began to exist, right?
Yeah.
You began to exist, and the reason you began to exist is because your parents one night, the mood was right, the candles were lit, and don't think about it too long.
Yeah.
So it's like, their action, they existed before you, outside of you, and their action created you.
Yeah.
You began to exist. Your birthday is what? When's your birthday?
It's
Do you
December.
remember this? Okay,
Yeah.
you hesitated. December what? Do you not know this?
It's in the 80s, late
No, the
1900s.
date, December.
3 days after Christmas, my guy.
December
25th, 28th.
You
hit 40 and you're like, it's in December.
The actual date.
It's a century ago.
So, December 28th. So you began to exist, or you began to exist 9 months before that. But okay, so you came into existence. Okay, so for that to happen, your existence is contingent or dependent upon your parents doing this action that created you. So
Yeah.
So everyone basically said, okay, but what's the non-contingent, infinite, eternal thing that always has existed? That's eternal.
Yeah.
It's forever. It never started to exist. And everyone said, well, that was easy. It's the universe. The universe is eternal. It's always been around. It's infinite. It never started, never began. And so we'd have all kinds of discussions about that. So there's no need for God, right? The kid out in the playground, well, if God exists, who'd invented God? And they'd run away. Well, here's the problem with that argument. The claim that God exists isn't the problem. It's that he began to exist. And the kid's not thinking about the fact that the argument is not about something existing. It's when it began to exist. So
this is a principle.
It's a principle. So that was all fine. It was like, well, the universe is the non-contingent, infinite, eternal thing, and we all got here because it exists. Great,
Right.
and everyone would move on because now you have no need for God. You have no need for a metaphysical, beyond the physical world explanation for anything, until the 1920s, when Edwin Hubble looked through his telescope and started to see that the universe was actually expanding.
In motion.
In moving apart. And of course, he did the scientific work and the mathematical work and began to realize that 14.5 billion years ago, all time, energy, matter began to exist in a single moment and shot away. And still, to this day, everything's moving away from this moment, right? Everything is a huge explosion, right? So, and the weird thing about that, though, for the podcast listeners, this is the crazy part. So we, guys like us, regular Joes, we tend to think, okay, yeah, all the galaxies and stars and planets, they're all moving away from each other, but that's not actually true. They're in place.
Right.
What's moving, ready for this, is space itself. What? Where is it going? What's it moving into? Right?
Yeah.
Space is moving. So it's like a balloon. And all the galaxies are like buttons on the balloon, and the balloon is expanding, and the buttons are in place, and they're just moving apart right now at light speeds. But space is the balloon. Space, what do you mean? I thought space is, what are we talking about? So anyway, that's the stuff that keeps me awake at night. So, space is moving. So it's expanding. So he did the math, and he went, well, if all of this is true at the rate of expansion, if you rewind it all back, that was about 14.5 billion years ago. So then the philosophical discussion was, okay, all the scientific community agreed. I mean, you never get a monolithic, everyone agrees, but generally speaking. And so now the question is, take it back to the formula. Whatever begins to exist has to have a cause. Well, now we know the universe began to exist. So the universe has to have a cause because it began to exist. So therefore, you have something outside of it, the universe, to create it, So now, that's not like a for sure proof of like, well, now let me tell you who that God is, but it certainly points to the fact that it's less reasonable to believe that we've just always been than somebody actually started this thing.
Right.
It's actually less rational because remember, we want to follow the evidence.
Right.
The thing that my family always bust my chops about was you got to follow the evidence. Don't be stupid. Follow the evidence. Okay, I'm trying to follow the evidence now. So now the evidence is like, how did all of this begin? I mean, if it began with what they called back then a bang.
They don't call it that anymore?
I mean, there's There's all kinds of debate. I mean, you go online, there's all kinds of debates about everything, right? Everybody's debating, the speed of light and is the Big Bang. But if you woke up in the middle of the night tonight, if there was a big bang down in your basement, and you woke up and you looked over at your wife and you said, "What was that? What caused that?" And she went, "Nothing."
Yeah.
You'd be like, well, that's an excuse for wanting to go back to sleep. Right? And so we can either follow the evidence and go research it and
that's good.
Right? Somebody bang the universe.
He said that's an excuse to go back to sleep.
Right. But that's what it is.
Yeah.
And for those of you who watch this and go, I'm looking at the evidence for the beginning of the universe, and I don't want to entertain the idea that maybe a person, some kind of something created this universe.
Yeah.
It's an excuse to go back to sleep and move on with your life. Because here's the thing. There's always a reason behind the thing. There's always a thing behind the thing, right?
Yeah.
Timothy Keller, who's he was a pastor and a thinker, and writer. He talked about the idea that college kids would come to New York, where he had his church, and they would go to university or whatever, and they'd be Christians, and they would show up, and over the course of a year or two, they would stop believing in God. And when he would sit with them and say, "Why did you stop believing in God?" They would say, "Well, the reason is because I went to my philosophy department, and we read whatever Nietzsche and that epistemologically, homiletically, I just don't believe in the existence of the whatever." And so, but really, when he got into it, what he realized was they started sleeping around with some people.
Yeah.
And they liked it.
Yeah.
And they decided to take that and move backward and construct a theology or philosophy and a worldview of life that fit what they were liking. Mm-hmm. They wanted to go back to sleep. Right? Just shut it off and let me continue in the mode that I'm moving. So we always have to ask the question about the motivation of the thing we believe. So are you facing the evidence, or are you not facing it? So that was one of the first big ones. Within that, by the way, and we could talk about this in the next question too, a bit of overlap, but there's laws that had to exist for the Big Bang to ever work. Right. For the bam, light, time, energy, matter, and all the planets, going away from each other.
Yeah.
All of that still happening today. For that to work, all the philosophies, Stephen Hawking, everybody went, okay, there's probably, there's debate. Like one guy says there's 122 laws that would have had to be working exactly within a millionth for the universe to ever actually work and not just collapse into a fireball. For there to be life and people and plants and all the moon this far away, all this called the Anthropic Principle. All that to actually work, there would have had to have been 122 dials lined up within a millionth for any of it to work. Now, a mathematician looks at this problem and says, this is the definition of a miracle. There's no possible way that those dials get dialed into that percentage point. But here's the question that keeps me awake. Where did the dials even come from? They had to pre-exist the Big Bang to ever work.
Right.
The dials can't come into existence, the rate of expansion, can't come into existence when they already have to be in place.
It's like what you're saying is kind of like the theme of this. God never intended faith to be complicated. Like this is not complicated.
Yes.
Somebody designed this thing.
Yes.
Somebody set this in motion. And you're looking for evidence, and the answer is right in front of your face.
Yeah.
That there's a purpose to this.
Yeah.
That there's something going on here that can be traced back to a creator, or do people still use the term intelligent design?
Right.
Like somebody has an idea.
Yes.
Like he started it.
Right.
And what we call him, right, the divine, this is the creator, and everything else is a created being. This is not or a created thing. It's not complicated.
Yeah.
We're making it complicated.
We're making it complicated.
Like what Timothy Keller said. Like we're trying to work our way backwards so that we can give ourselves the excuse,
Yeah.
And I think I was this close to doing that when I was 20.
Yeah.
And I decided, you know what? I'm going to give my life to Jesus. You had a moment like that. What was it for you?
Yeah. I was 17, 18 years old doing a bunch of this research. And to your point about the created things and the complication, I remember reading recently there was, you look at all this evidence and you see the beginning, we'll talk about DNA, and you look and you say, what are the reasons for this? Mm-hmm. And what actually created this? And there's a theory if you go on the internet, there's lots of theories on the internet, but there's one called panspermia, which is if you take all of the stuff, the DNA and the complicated reality that you're talking about the universe, and you need an excuse that isn't God, the best excuse is aliens. So literally,
it's still creator.
Yeah, because you need a mind to create something.
Yeah.
To put but of course the question, it's an interesting theory. Did aliens create us and they're sitting there watching us and they figured out how to go through black holes
or are we in a simulation?
Are we in a simulation?
But I mean, it's still creator.
Who created the aliens?
Yes.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Right. It just pushes.
My son, when I was taking my son to school when he was 4 years old. And we're at a stoplight. I'll never forget this. And he goes, "Dad, are aliens real?" Right. And he's 4. He's on his way to preschool. And I go, "I don't know. It's a pretty big universe out there. I imagine God could create as much stuff as he wants, right?" And he's like, yeah. He's like, "But you think they're out there?" And I'm like, "Well, if there are aliens, then God created them."
Yeah.
And he goes, "Yeah, that makes sense."
Yeah.
And then he goes, like, we're about to turn. The light hasn't even turned yet. And he goes, "Dad, when I get older, I think I want to be an astronaut and I want to go to the moon. I want to set up chairs so I can tell all the aliens about how Jesus created them."
Come on. I love it.
I swear to you, true
That's
story.
awesome.
And for career day, true story, he wore an astronaut suit with a Bible and said he wants to be a pastronaut when he grows up.
Come on.
I'm not making this up.
I
Gave him
that?
I swear, dude. That was his thing because he's like,
hilarious.
okay, there's a creator. And I know him, right? And other people don't know him. And there's aliens out there.
Right.
There's lost aliens who might not know about who created them.
C.S. Lewis talked about this often.
I know that.
And he talks about the idea that
if you don't talk about aliens, I mean, are you even
in touch?
Yeah.
He talked about the cross of Christ and whether in these alien civilizations, maybe they haven't even fallen yet.
Yeah.
And Jesus, maybe the cross of Christ is applicable universally to them when they need it. All these deep philosophical. Anyway, all that to say, this isn't get off on the topic of aliens. We could be here for a while.
We could talk about it.
Yeah. So
I can talk about it.
Second.
Just in summary, that question was like, how do I know if God is real for sure? Like, talk to that person for a second who would say, "Hey, I'm just struggling just for enough evidence." You know, because I don't know if the Bible talks about blind faith or like leaps of faith, but definitely talks about steps of faith. So, how do you make a step toward that?
Yeah. Well, for me, the second thing I did beyond that was thinking about more the less scientific, more philosophical question about the moral reality in us and realizing, and this was one of the big ones for me, when I'm a 17, 18-year-old kid, to come back to your question, and a guy's telling me about Jesus in high school, woodworking class, and I had heard things about Jesus in my life. I had gone to a summer camp and heard about Christ, and it was cool. But when he was telling me, and I'm starting to research this, one of the big things that bothered me, which has bothered many converts throughout history, was the fact of morality. So if you're here, if you're watching this, and you're like, I don't think there's great evidences for God, the scientific stuff is solid. The philosophical stuff is solid because the question of morality is one of the most potent points. Paul says in Romans chapter 2 that God has put a moral law within us.
Yeah.
Well, that, of course, is a philosophical problem if it's all purely about Darwinian instincts, right? And so then the reality that is always wrong wouldn't be something that was wired in you as a human being if all we are is products of millions of years of making decisions that were best for our tribe, and those being wired into us over hundreds of thousands of years because might be the way that you actually move your seed into the next generation.
Right.
A shark is a shark. Yeah. A shark doesn't, but we don't call it, but a shark forcibly copulates in order to populate the ocean.
Right.
But we don't say, wow, hey, shark, don't that lady, right? Or that woman shark. So a lion, sorry, it wouldn't be called a lady. A lion, when a lion rips a zebra apart and we don't call it murder.
Right.
It's the animal kingdom is vastly different than the human kingdom.
Right.
So where along the line did we decide you can't just murder somebody?
All right, hold on. I got a good question. I got
to
a good
move
question.
your tribe forward.
Here's the phrase. I was raised on the theory of evolution.
Yes.
How do I choose between science and faith? So talk about evolution for a
Okay.
second, because there is a theory, right? There are Christian people who believe in evolution, right? Macro versus micro.
Yeah.
And then, you know, there's this possibility, right? 10,000 years ago, there was the Homo erectus versus the Homo sapien and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Have you ever, I mean, where do you land on that, or do you feel like you need to land on that?
Yeah.
I mean, it could be a step towards somebody.
Yeah,
helping
no, for sure. So okay.
Answer the question however you want. Sorry.
Yeah, no,
that's
that's
my personal question.
Yeah. So
where are you on the Homo erectus versus Homo?
So not to plug the problem of life, but the problem of life coming out in February.
Oh, that's your new book title?
Yeah.
Okay, so we get the problem of God.
Yeah.
And you get the problem of Jesus, which I have sitting over there.
Yes.
And then the problem of life.
Yes. So
I
there's
love that
literally
title.
a chapter on the problem of origins in it, and it talks about exactly what you just said. And I quote from John Stott that talks about, is it that weird of a concept? God takes the dust of the earth and he takes what's already there and he breathes a soul into it in Genesis 2. Is it that weird of a concept that you could look at these pre-Adamic hominid things and go, okay, they're cavemen batting people around, fire, but they're not a soul yet.
Right,
but at some point,
right.
God takes this pre-existing Homo erectus, whatever, and it becomes Homo sapien. Sapien means thinking wise man, right?
Yeah.
And it becomes soul now, which explains how, Cain and Abel can have a family.
Right. They're not, it's
Right?
not
It's like
pure 100% incest.
Right. It's like there's other things going on out there. And so so is that, now, come back to your, coming back to my point about the morality and
But real quick, in case people didn't
evolution,
catch what you just said, the word Adam technically means mankind, right? In Hebrew?
Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of a plural kind of word, right?
Yeah.
Like
and Eve means life.
Yeah.
So it's this beautiful story about how humankind and life came to have a soul.
Right. And what it could possibly be describing basically one person out of a larger group
I think
of
that's
people.
probably what happened. Yeah. I think at some point there is a legitimate historical Adam and Eve. But it's like it's God takes these and breathes into them and they become, I think that's probably one of the ways that you can navigate this. I don't think so. The problem with the pure theory of evolution, I mean, obviously there's problems that you and I don't even know about, the eyeball and how it works, and it doesn't make any sense. And this step toward that, and you need this. The problem of it is like the initial origin of the bacteria becoming a thing. We don't know. There's all kinds of theories, but we don't have any evidence to what that first move is, all that. But there's also a philosophical one, because as I was talking about earlier, if you have these moral constructs that you and I have, we know murder is wrong, we know is wrong, an explanation that is pure animalistic doesn't work because you would have been wired different. So there's a guy who argues, Steven Pinker wrote a book. There's this girl named Melissa Drexler. Basically, she went to her prom. She had a baby in the bathroom. Death, threw it in a garbage can, and went back out and danced at prom. This was 1997.
Bro, the way you just shotgun these graphic things, you're like, it's a shark, just a lady shark. All right, she goes to the bathroom, she dips out a baby, she lit. Can you give us a beat, bro?
I'm just trying to get to the point. We're on a time limit here. Okay, I'm not gonna draw these stories out.
Bring it back a notch. All right, okay, so murdering
she
pregnant.
Murders a child, goes back to the prom. And Steven Pinker.
I remember that. That didn't happen that long ago.
1997.
Yeah.
So
I was in 8th grade. But
So Steven Pinker wrote an article, and he's a evolutionary thinker.
Pinker?
And Steven Pinker, yeah. And he said, here's the deal. Melissa Drexler simply did what our great-great-great-great-grandmothers have been doing since the beginning of time, which is you have to kill the weakest in the litter so that the strongest survive. And what she did was courageous, and it's wired into her brain from our past animalistic instincts. If you're trying to carry 10 cubs across a river and one moron is back there flopping around, you need to kill it to not slow down the other ones.
Right.
That's how the animal kingdom works.
And that's how evolution, that's the theory.
Well, that's how we got here.
That's how we got
here.
here.
To make these decisions.
Yeah.
So over hundreds of thousands of years, women's brains have been wired and coded to do this. Ergo, you can't judge her moralistically for this decision. We are so here's the problem. Why do those of you watching this, listening to this, disagree with Pinker? Why would you say every human life is so important, you should never? Why? There's somewhere along the line where your morals raised a question that being an animal would never have encoded into you. And this is one of the problems with a pure naturalistic view of it. Because of course there's evolution, but then there's naturalistic evolution, which is like, this is all just nature. There is no God. There is no all that. So here's the problem. When we look at that, because even the question, this is one of the false dichotomies is I don't believe in God because I'm a naturalist. Stephen Jay Gould, who was a paleontologist, Oxford professor, evolutionary thinker, he said this. To the question of science and God, they're actually what he called non-overlapping magisteria. He called it the Noma Principle. And he basically said this. Science deals in the realm of physics, right? We look at plants and bodies and biology and stars, and you can't answer what's called a metaphysical. The Greek word meta means after or beyond. You can't answer a metaphysical question, the question of God, by doing physics. It's a category mistake. To go, I can look at plants and soil and deduce something about the metaphysical world. That's not a thing. So he would call it he's like, guys, we're in the realm of physics. Let the theologians figure out how the physics equal metaphysical answers, but we can't adjudicate the question of God's existence purely by science. Yeah. Right? And so the concept because every time you do, it's a philosophical question. It's a philosophy. Every person watching this, even if you're a skeptic, you already have metaphysical beliefs about everything. Right. You actually. So I had this nurse that was in my church, and she came up to me one day and she was struggling. She said, here's the problem. We were told at work that all of our decisions have to be secular decisions. You can't as a nurse, you can't decide to get together with the family and say you should let that person die now because they're going to go to heaven or be with God or whatever. And so the hospital is to be a purely naturalistic, don't bring faith into it kind of place, right? So this family came in, made a decision about their loved one, pulled the plug, died. All the doctors were sitting for coffee after, and they said, well, that was the right decision because at least he's not suffering anymore.
What an assumption.
That's a metaphysical belief about the afterlife.
Yeah.
Right? You believe that nothing happens when you die. Right. Ergo, this person's not suffering. But you have no evidence of this, that this person's not suffering more. Yeah. How do you know they're not suffering? How do you know they haven't gone into some kaleidoscope? You have no evidence, but you have a metaphysical belief about the afterlife based on nothing. Yeah. And so what we believe is, no, let's look at some evidence. Yeah. The Bible, Jesus, history, and go, no, there actually is some evidence that points to this. So I think all of this to say, the other one of the problems purely philosophically with pure evolutionary theory is, to come back to that original question, Mitch Stokes, who's a philosopher, points this out. Now, if you follow this argument, it's kind of hard to follow, but it does make sense.
Go for it.
It basically says this. If
I want you to use sharks and aliens.
And aliens in the illustration.
Yeah, just to help us.
I will try, but it might be tough. So basically what he says is some people look and they say that your belief in the existence of God is simply like a pure naturalistic. If I was a naturalistic evolutionary thinker, I would look at you, Justice, and I would say, your belief in God is some artifact that's in you that got wired into your cognitive faculties because you needed hope because you were fighting off other polar bears and sharks and aliens were visiting you and you had to fight them off. Okay. So your family had such a terrible existence. You had to come up with some concept that made you feel better about yourself when you were still, beating things with bats and making, all that. Okay. So it's an artifact that's in your cognitive faculties that tells you there's a God and it's telling you something that's wrong. Okay. Now, the problem with that is every single one of us deduces everything about our life through these cognitive faculties that we've been given. And this is where it bites back, if you take that philosophy, the problem with it is even science And the evolutionary theory itself is a result of the same cognitive faculties you're telling me I can't trust about God. So you're now you've put yourself in that argument, you've put yourself in a matrix. You can't believe in God because you can't trust your cognitive faculties. But let me give you the theory of evolution that was created by the same cognitive faculties that I can't trust.
Right.
And you cut off the branch you're sitting on.
Right.
Because you can't trust. Your cognitive faculties could be telling you all these things about evolution, but you can't trust them because they were wired in there for your survival.
Right.
So, and this is exactly what Darwin said. He said this. He said, everything that we believe is basically the product of a monkey's mind. And then he said, but how could I trust the convictions of a monkey's mind?
It's the same thing.
We don't even know what we don't know.
Yeah.
To your point about, are we in the simulation, man? Like, so there's a lot of philosophical reasons to go, actually, the same arguments you're using against people who don't believe in it are arguments that make it untrue.
Yeah.
And so you have to be careful to build your life on a worldview, coming back to the point here, that is evidential, that answers the questions of origins, meaning, morality, and destiny with conviction, with history, with philosophy that doesn't contradict itself. And when I started researching those things, I started realizing you don't have to throw God out to be a scientific thinker. If you look at Alistair McGrath, John Polkinghorne, John Lennox, these guys are mathematicians working at Oxford, Cambridge. They're all theists. They all believe in God. Alvin Plantinga, who they say is the greatest living philosopher on the planet, is a philosophy professor, changed philosophy in America to the point where now 50 or 60% of the faculty of philosophy departments in universities are theists. They believe in God. It was all Alvin Plantinga. He's said to be the greatest living philosopher, and he's a Christian. He's a believer. So, last illustration. So, Star Trek. I don't know if you've watched Star Trek, but back in the original Star Trek days, okay, 1960s, they're running around, Captain Kirk's sleeping with green ladies or whatever. He's just jumping around the planets, and they're
just cosmic flirting, just landing on planets,
and just being like, okay. So he's going around, and he's doing. And in that 1960s version, here was the philosophy as we started to delve more and more into science. The more we delved into science the last 200 years, what we thought was going to happen post-Enlightenment was there was going to be no reason for belief in God anymore.
Right.
Deeper science went, the more theism would look stupid. So we went and we went and we went and went. And in the 1960s, that was still the philosophy. So ergo, their version of the future is they're running around and there's no spirituality in the original Star Trek.
Right.
There's no God. There's no one on the Enterprise that's like, what do we spiritually think about these existential moralistic questions? It's just jumping around, having some fun. In the Next Generation,
Star Trek Next Generation
came out in the late 80s,
I
early
didn't know
90s.
you were a Star Trek guy.
I'm not really a Trekkie.
I thought you were a Star Wars guy.
Yeah, I'm more of a Star Wars guy than a Star Trek guy.
I need an episode on
it was
that.
on. There was nothing going on. In the 90s, Next Generation comes out, and it's now been 30 years. And there's lots of spirituality in Star Trek Next Generation.
Interesting.
There's people on the ship that are like spiritual advisors.
And you're saying that's a reflection of where we have gone as a society, as a culture, where before we rejected all of this theism, like you're a simpleton.
Yep.
The future, there's no spirituality, but the more we've gotten away from these things,
the more we've delved into science,
the
more science has pointed out legitimate reasons to believe in God, the more we put back in spirituality. So now in the 1990s version, there's spirituality in the future because we started realizing exactly what is happening, which is the more science delves into, whether it's DNA, and DNA, you have a code in you. So when Darwin was poking around, he was doing what's called observational science. Okay, he's poking around turtles and the Galapagos Islands. He's looking at bird wings. He's drawing stuff out. That's microscope stuff. That's like what we now have is we're getting in and we can see DNA. Francis Crick, 1950s, found the greatest scientific discovery of the 20th century was Francis Crick finding the DNA. Okay. And he sketches it out and he realizes there's literally a code in human beings, a code, a mathematical code, Gattaca. That's like, this defines whether you're brown-eyed, blue-eyed, blonde hair. It defines your taste. It defines whether you're going to get cancer at 40. It defines everything about you is coded in, and it's a language. It's a literal language. And we know based on nature. Nature it produces patterns by itself. It does not produce code. It doesn't produce information where you can type it into a computer. And all of that DNA started to speak to, there's a mind behind creation. There's a mind behind it. And so what started to happen is we sketched out the whole human genome, and we began to realize, oh my gosh, somebody built a code into every cell has libraries full of information, and the information isn't random. So
wild. And Darwin had no idea of seeing that deep.
No,
he's just observing.
He's observing externally. He's not inside.
Right.
Looking at genomes and realizing, oh my gosh, there's a code that I was talking to a guy who went to MIT, and he's working on curing cancer and Alzheimer's literally 2 days ago. And he's like, I can take one drop of your blood and figure out whether you're going to have Alzheimer's, and I could probably solve Alzheimer's in the next 2 or 3 years. This is what him and his team are working on this.
Wow.
And it's by putting sequences into your DNA that fill in the gaps, and then they put it back into you, and it tricks your body into thinking that you don't have that DNA anymore.
Wow.
Crazy. But you have to get into the code. And he's like, Mark, everything's mechanical. He's like, we're all machines. It's all coded in. Anyway, all that to say, to your point, Darwin didn't know about this coding, and we now know about it since the 1950s. And since then, there's been an increase in our ability to go, you know what? It's not that crazy to believe in God. It's not that crazy to believe, which is why all these really smart people, not dumb Joe Blow, it's like when you go on CNN and you watch, we're going to see a debate tonight. And on the side of atheism, we have Dr. Richard Dawkins, a paleontologist, Darwinian thinker from Oxford. Say hello. Hello. What are you doing today? I'm going to talk to you about the philosophical anthropology of the paleontology, whatever. And then you're like, okay. And then representing Christianity, we got Joe.
A youth pastor from South Carolina.
A youth pastor from South Carolina who lives in a swamp and thinks Oprah's the Antichrist. Right, whatever. And it's like, and he's like, yeah, what's that? And you're like, oh my gosh. Listen, that is no longer the situation.
Right.
The mathematicians believe.
Yeah.
The scientists believe. The philosophers believe. The psychologists believe. There's a lady named Marilyn Schlitz. She talks about the idea that all the psychology in the world right now is telling us that there seems to be something conscious about us beyond our brains. And whether that's there's a whole thing out there, and I talk about this in the Problem of Light too. There's a whole thing out there about, people who have near-death experiences and the whole philosophy of they're dead, and they have some conscious situation happen, and they come back, and it's like, was it just the brain circuitry, or was there something? And all the psychology is telling us there seems to be something else beyond just our brain chemicals. Right. Anyway, all that to say, coming back to your point, there's actually more growing evidence, as the deeper we delve, more evidence for the existence of God rather than less. And I think that's leading us to a place where at least you got to look at the evidence versus ignoring it, which is all the stuff I kind of traced down, ran the ramp of reason before taking the leap of faith and filling in the gap and going, okay, there is legitimate reasons to believe in this.
So there's the wonder of whoa, there has to be, this is unexplainable. This is, like you said, a scientific miracle when you look at the probability, mathematically speaking.
Sure.
So that's wonder, right? Yeah. And then there's also just the exponential rate that information is being, discovered, right?
Yeah.
So everybody is discovering all these different things, the things that you mentioned regarding, studying genomes and now all these people are saying, whoa, there's this pursuit is now actually asking, we're saying, hey, maybe this is not as crazy. I think it's easy to follow what you're saying. If you were to keep it uncomplicated, if God never intended faith to be complicated, why are we making this complicated, Mark?
Go back to the garden. God's walking with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day, and we decided we wanted the taste of blackberries over him. And we do it every day. We take sex over God. We take money over God. We take reputation over God. We take, whatever. And I think that's part of. I mean, if you took the complicated filter and read the fall story, we wanted to make it more complicated. You will know if you do this. You will know you have the knowledge of good and evil.
Right.
Your life will become more complicated.
Yeah.
And we chose that complexity over walking with God in the cool of the day, and we do it all the time. And I understand the impulse toward doubt. I don't think that's always a bad thing. I know there's a gap between our information and God. God isn't sitting here. We can't see him. We can't hear his voice audibly. We have impressions. Obviously the Bible is a big, like, how is the miracle of this? And it's like even secular psychologists talk about that. They look back and they say, man, the miracle of the Bible, blah.
Phenomenon.
Great. But obviously we can't see him. We can't prove him. But all we're saying in that, and this is where we just have to work on ourselves, all we're saying is we can't prove him in the way that we in the modern era would prove a thing. And should that actually be the main hermeneutic in which we decide things? So it's like, because the problem is we could just potentially in that moment only be a product of our cultural moment. You know it, that we live in a world where everyone is just reading the teleprompter of our culture. And they're just saying and believing the things that people in this year believe in this part of the world. But there's but does that make it true? So one illustration I use is when you talk about sex. The ethic of Jesus. Okay, here's the illustration. Ethic of Jesus is this: if I went to a Western person in LA, okay, and I said, hey, what is it that you like about Jesus, his teachings, and what do you not like? They would say, well, I love his stuff on, like, love your enemy, right? That stuff's awesome, right? Like, we should love our enemy, man. Come on, let's go. His sex stuff, it's a little conservative, old school. One woman, marriage, bored, right? I mean, how conservative can you get? But that stuff about love your enemy, that's great. And we should fight the military-industrial complex, and we should not be globalization, and we should okay? So that's somebody in L.A. sitting there drinking their Starbucks, $6 Starbucks, whatever. Now you take a plane and you fly over to Saudi Arabia or Tel Aviv or something. And you walk around and you say, hey, what do you like about Jesus? Here's what they'll say. Well, that sex stuff, probably not conservative enough.
Right.
Needs to be. We need to hone that in a bit, like women walking around and being all free and whatnot. We need to.
Their hair's just hanging out. Everyone can see their hair.
Driving.
Going to school.
Yeah. Jesus, got to lock that stuff down. You got to get these women in their place.
By the way, probably not Tel Aviv.
Yeah. Fair enough. But the love your enemy,
no way.
Not happening.
Yeah.
Because 3 generations ago, they blew up my family's village, and there is no possible way I'm ever forgiving them. So the question is, which one is right? And how much are you making decisions about what is right based on the cultural moment that you happen to be living in and the teleprompter that you're reading that's not being influenced by anything else? You and your friends are sitting around talking about the same stuff as an echo chamber and not realizing that there's truth trying to get in. And so just be careful that you don't think just as a product of your cultural moment, but you actually allow God to speak into it and you follow the evidence.
That's good stuff, bro. I think what you're saying is easy for people to follow. Would you just take a second?
Hopefully this can all be got up for its snot on the face.
Can we get this guy another line of Coke? I would just take a second as we wrap up, if you wouldn't mind. Look at that camera, the person who's like, my life feels really complicated, and just, they want a reason to believe. They want a reason to believe.
Yeah. God is pursuing you, and the evidence of that is that you're watching this moment. He's a good father who puts people in your life and situations in your life that has you watching this. See, every left turn you made, every right turn, every conversation you had, or whatever, it got you to a moment like this, where there's a story that Jesus tells about a young son who goes off and sins and makes mistakes and has a lot of shame and guilt in his life. And the minute he says, I want to come back to God, he walks over the hill, and the father sees him, and he doesn't punish him, and he doesn't hate on him, and he runs out to him, and he wraps his own robe around him, would have been his robe, and he throws a party for him. And that's the kind of father you get in Jesus. You get a father who will love you, who runs out to you, who's already putting things, people, situations, circumstances in your life so he can draw you to himself. And the minute you go, I'm sorry, I want to have purpose in my life, I want to have fulfillment in my life, I want to follow you in my life, he wraps you, and he loves you, and he empowers you. And I think that is ultimately, then he gives you something to do in the world, which gives you purpose and identity and joy. So I think just the fact that you're even here and asking these questions is a grace, that he's put that impulse in you to be curious. And there's this great line. I don't know if you've watched Ted Lasso, but I haven't watched a ton of it. But there's a great scene I saw where he's in the bar and he's throwing darts at the guy says, "Oh, you're never going to be able to throw three what's it called when you right in the middle, bullseye. And he needs to get 3 bullseyes to win." And the whole bar is like, and he goes, "Okay, well, what would you give me if I could throw 3 bullseyes in a row?" And the bar, he's like, and there was huge stakes at, whatever it was. And so he stops and he says, when I was a kid, I walked by this quote that was on this wall by Walt Whitman, and it said, "Be curious, not judgmental." And he said, if instead of just razzing me at this bar tonight, you would ask me, "Ted, how did you grow up?" I might have told you. And he takes the dart and he goes, whoom, boom, first bullseye. I might have told you that every day from the time I was 6 to the time I was 18, I would go to my uncle's bar. And we would sit there and we would play darts. Boom, when he throws the second one. And the whole bar is like, what the? And then he said, blah, blah, blah. And when my father died and he raised me, and he throws a third, the whole bar explodes, third. And that line, be curious, not judgmental.
Yeah.
We go through life judgmental of everything. And what I love about the fact that you're even this far is that you're being curious about the question of God, not judgmental on it.
Wow.
And God wants to take that curiosity and draw you to himself versus leaving you where you are.
So good. I get a little emotional thinking about it because I know God has been at work in my life in such a way. And when you say that it's a grace that we even have the capacity, to recognize this.
It's amazing.
That is grace.
Yep.
So you have more questions about faith. You've never tried reading the Bible. Download the Uncomplicated app. You'll get the New Testament with a whole catalog of questions by Mark, by myself, just answering those things that are they're God's working on your heart, or maybe that have you're like, life feels complicated, relations feel complicated. How does science and work together? All that kind of stuff. We've got a catalog of questions, and you can read or listen to the Bible. It's for free on the Uncomplicated app. God bless you guys.